Chapter 1. The Empire under Augustus, Expansion into Germania. When Augustus officially took over the sole rule of Rome in 27 BC, the empire was at a turning point. Decades of civil war had torn the country apart, but now an era of relative stability began, which would later be called Pax Augusta or Pax Romana. Under Augustus, Rome reached a new size, territorially, politically, and culturally. But peace was not synonymous with stagnation. Augustus knew how to combine expansion and consolidation. While he created a new order within, he strove outwardly for secure borders and new conquests. One of these borders ran along the Rhine, and it was here that one of the most momentous decisions of his rule was soon to take place: the attempt to conquer Germania. At the time of Augustus, the Roman Empire was a huge entity that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of the Alps. But the northern border remained uncertain. Gaul had been conquered under Julius Caesar and had long since been Romanized. But on the other side of the Rhine, in the endless forests and moors of Germania, there lived tribes that were not so easily subdued. These peoples were alien and elusive to the Romans. They had no large cities, no fixed kings, but a multitude of small tribal communities that sometimes allied and sometimes fought each other. It was precisely this fragmentation that gave Augustus hope of being able to subjugate Germania between the Rhine and Elbe and incorporate it as a province. The strategic reasons for this were clear. As long as Germania remained independent, Gaul was never completely safe. Again and again there were raids across the Rhine, and the Roman garrisons had to be defended at great expense. In addition, the land on the other side of the Rhine promised rich resources: cattle, slaves, raw materials. And last but not least, it was about prestige. Augustus not only wanted to secure the empire, but also to enlarge it and thus legitimize his rule. Each new stretch of land that was subjugated to Rome was a sign of its strength and a proof that the time of unrest was over. In the first years after the birth of Christ, Roman legions under generals such as Drusus and Tiberius began to advance systematically into Germania. They built bridges over the Rhine, built fortified camps, and forced tribes to submit. These expeditions were dangerous, as the terrain was completely unfamiliar to the Romans. Unlike Gaul, which was clearly structured by roads, rivers, and cities, a world of dense forests, swampy soils, and endless wilderness awaited them here. For the legionnaires, who were used to open battles and orderly marches, this represented a huge challenge. But at first, the project seemed to be successful. Around 7 AD, Augustus believed that Germania was pacified to such an extent that it could be organized as a province. A Roman governor was appointed, Publius Quinctilius Varus, an experienced administrator who had previously served in Syria. His task was to establish law and order, introduce tribute payments, and finally bind the region to Rome. The work seemed to be complete. The Romans were in the process of creating a new province that shifted the border from the uncertain line along the Rhine to the Elbe further east. But even in these years, cracks appeared in this apparent success. Roman rule was based primarily on coercion and alliance with some Germanic elites. Many tribes accepted foreign rule only reluctantly, saw the tribute demands as a burden and the Roman judiciary as an encroachment on their traditions. It was hard for the common warriors to bear that their leaders formed Roman alliances, seemingly depriving them of their freedom. Beneath the surface, a resistance was brewing that the Romans did not recognize or take seriously. Augustus himself was convinced that he was opening a new chapter of Roman greatness with the conquest of Germania. He dreamed of an imperial border on the Elbe that would permanently secure the empire. In his self-portrayal, the famous residential gesti, he presented the Germania policy as a success, even if he glossed over reality. For him, expansion was a means of legitimizing his rule, portraying his family, the Julii, as protectors of the empire and presenting Rome as an invincible world power. In Rome itself, the mood was mixed. Many senators welcomed the conquests, as they promised wealth and prestige. Others warned of the enormous costs and risks. But Augustus carried out his plan. Germania was not only to be conquered, but Romanized. Roads, cities, and administrative centers were planned. There was already talk of how Germania could be integrated into the order of the empire, similar to Gaul a few decades earlier. The reality at the border, however, was different. Legionnaires had to endure long marches through rough terrain, supplies were scarce, and the Germanic tribes remained restless. But all this seemed small compared to the grand visions. Augustus himself relied on his governors and generals, trusting that the power of Rome was unshakable. The thought that the barbarian Germanic tribes could pose a serious threat seemed far from him. This resulted in a dangerous mixture during these years: self-confidence on the Roman side, combined with growing resistance in Germania. Augustus, the great statesman, underestimated the complexity of this country and its people. While temples to the gods of victory were being built in Rome and the Elbe was being celebrated as the future border, an uprising was already being prepared in secret that was to shake the empire. The expansion into Germania was therefore not a side project, but a central part of Augustan politics. It symbolized the claim to push the borders of the empire further and further, to extend Rome's influence beyond the Rhine and thus to consolidate the power of the emperor. But it was precisely this claim that led to the catastrophe that was to shake the world in 9 AD. For in the dark forests of Germania lurked an opponent who knew Rome better than Rome knew him, and who was ready to answer the hubris of the empire with blood and fire. Chapter 2. Germania before the battle, tribes, culture, and society. If you look at the image of Germania in the years before the famous Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, you should not confuse it with the ideas of later nations or even states. Germania was not a unified area, but a patchwork of tribes, clans, and loose tribal alliances that shared common linguistic and cultural characteristics, but were by no means under common leadership. For the Romans, it was a land of forests, swamps, and endless expanses, populated by people who did not want to bow to their laws. For the Germanic tribes themselves, it was a homeland in which they lived from cattle breeding and the yield of small fields, where they gained prestige through military undertakings and in which the bond of family and tribe was more important than any superior order. The landscape of Germania had a decisive influence on the lives of its inhabitants. Dense forests covered wide areas, crossed by rivers such as the Rhine, the Elbe, and the Weser. Large moors made journeys difficult. Rain and fog created an atmosphere that seemed inhospitable and foreign to Romans. Agriculture was possible, but laborious, as the soil was difficult to work in many places. The Germanic tribes combined agriculture with livestock breeding and lived in small villages or scattered farmsteads. The climate was harsher than in Gaul or Italy. The winters were cold and long. All this formed a society that demanded toughness and adaptability. Politically, the tribes were fragmented. There were no central kingdoms, but numerous small units such as the Cherusei, the Bructerians, the Marses, the Chatti, the Chalks, or the Usipetians. Each of these communities had its own leaders, who did not rule like kings with absolute power, but rather acted as military commanders or advisors. Decisions were often made in popular assemblies where free men took the floor and decided on war, peace, or alliances. Power was based less on fixed office than on personal reputation, bravery in battle, and the ability to gain allegiance. Those who were rich in cattle, who distributed booty or proved to be a charismatic warrior could secure followers, but these followers were not permanent, but dissolved when the leader weakened. Society was hierarchical, but less rigid than in the Roman Empire. At the top of the list were the free men, who were farmers and warriors at the same time. Women played a central role in the domestic sphere and were often described with respect by the Romans, as they were attributed prophetic gifts. It is said that Germanic warriors sought advice from women before battles or revered them as bearers of sacred traditions. There were also slaves, mostly prisoners of war, but they were fewer in number and their position less severe than in the Roman system. Culturally, the Germanic tribes were united by a common heritage of language, religion, and customs. Their religion was characterized by the worship of nature gods, sacred groves, springs, and trees. There were hardly any fixed shrines or temples. The encounter with the divine took place in nature. Gods such as Woden, Odin, Dana, Thor, or Tiwaz, Tyr, stood for war, fertility, and order. Sacrifices were often animals, occasionally humans, and they served to secure the favor of the gods in times of war or crop failures. For the Romans, these customs seemed barbaric, but for the Germanic tribes they were a natural part of their world, deeply rooted in daily life. The Germanic tribes were a warlike people, but not in the sense of a professional army as the Romans knew it. Every free man was both a farmer and a fighter, took up arms when the tribe was called, and then returned to his farm. They were armed with spears, shields, and swords, often with simple axes. Their tactics were based less on discipline than on courage and the sudden attack. They did not fight in orderly formations like the legions, but in loose groups that drew their strength from surprise and local knowledge. This made them unpredictable, but also vulnerable when they were on the open field against experienced Roman legionnaires. Contacts with Rome had increased in the decades before the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Merchants brought Roman goods across the Rhine, Germanic leaders received gifts, money, or even Roman citizenship rights if they made themselves useful as allies. Many tribes saw Rome as an overpowering neighbor who was better appeased or with whom they entered into tactical alliances. Others, on the other hand, resisted any form of submission. This ambivalence made Germania so difficult for Rome to control. Individual tribes could be won, but never all together. The self-image of the Germanic tribes was closely linked to freedom. They knew no emperor, no fixed bureaucracy, and no stone city wall, but lived in a world in which honor, loyalty, and courage determined the value of a man. For them, Roman rule meant a threat to this attitude to life. The Roman demand for taxes, duties, and fixed laws met with resistance because it collided with the traditional independence of the tribes. Before the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, Germania was a place of fragmentation, but also of strength. The Romans saw this as a sign of weakness because there was no central opponent to defeat. But it was precisely this diversity that proved to be dangerous. A skillful leader who united the tribes could get the Romans into trouble. The forests, moors, and rivers were natural allies. The harsh climate and the unpredictability of the tribes made the country difficult for Rome to grasp. For the Germanic tribes themselves, life was marked by insecurity. Small settlements, threatened by hunger, feuds, or hostile tribes. But this uncertainty also created toughness, courage, and the willingness to risk everything for one's own freedom. It was this attitude that was to become dramatically visible in 9 AD, when the tribes put aside their differences and lured one of the most powerful armies of the ancient world into a trap in the dark forests. Chapter 3: Rome and the Germanic Tribes: Friendship, Mistrust, and Submission. From the very beginning, the encounter between the Romans and the Germanic tribes was an interplay between cooperation and confrontation. For the Romans, the Germanic tribes were initially a military problem, but later they were also partners who could be won over for their own purposes. For the tribes, on the other hand, Rome was an ambivalent neighbor, powerful, rich, and fearsome, but at the same time a source of gifts, trade goods, and opportunities to secure advantages over other tribes. This field of tension gave rise to a complicated web of friendship, mistrust, and submission, which was ultimately to culminate in the catastrophe of the Battle of Varus. Since Caesar's conquest of Gaul in the 1st century BC, the Romans had contact with the Germanic tribes. Caesar himself led campaigns against groups such as the Usipetians or Tencterians, who had advanced across the Rhine into Gaul. He described the Germanic tribes as wild, dangerous opponents whose courage was impressive, but whose lack of discipline made them easy prey for orderly Roman warfare. At the same time, he used them as political tools, promoting individual tribes and fighting others in order to secure control of the Rhine border. This principle, divide and rule, later remained the strategy of the Romans in dealing with Germania. Under Augustus, the contact took on new dimensions. His generals Drusus and Tiberius penetrated far into Germanic territory, built bridges over the Rhine, and forced numerous tribes to recognize Roman supremacy. But this submission was rarely permanent. The Germanic tribes did not pay tributes out of conviction, but out of compulsion, and as soon as the legions withdrew, they rose again. Nevertheless, Rome managed to bind some leaders to itself by promising them Roman titles, money, or the prospect of power over rival tribes. Some Germanic princes sent their sons to Rome, where they were educated and trained militarily. This created a class of men who knew the Roman language and customs, who served as officers in Roman auxiliary troops and at the same time preserved their tribal identity. These dual loyalties would later prove disastrous. The Romans were masters at exerting influence through treaties and alliances. A tribe that swore allegiance to Rome could hope for military support when it came into conflict with neighbors. In this way, Rome succeeded in shifting the balance of power in Germania and playing tribes off against each other. But this policy also fueled mistrust. Many Germanic tribes recognized that Rome was not a neutral partner, but was pursuing its own goals, securing Gaul, gaining land and resources, expanding imperial power. In addition, there was the cultural contrast. While Rome was characterized by cities, streets, writing, and orderly laws, the Germanic tribes lived in a world of small villages, oral traditions, and loose tribal structures. When Roman governors began to administer justice and collect taxes, many Germanic tribes perceived this as an encroachment on their freedom. They reacted particularly violently when Roman officials disregarded traditional punishments or customs. What meant order for Rome appeared to the Germanic tribes as oppression. Despite everything, there were real forms of friendship and exchange. Merchants brought wine, oil, ceramics, and jewelry to Germania, while the Romans acquired amber, furs, and slaves. Germanic warriors served in Roman auxiliary troops and returned after years of service with new experiences and riches. Some adopted Roman weapons or fighting techniques, and the preference for certain luxury goods also spread among Germanic elites. In the eyes of many Romans, the tribes were thus on their way to being Romanized, a process that had already been successful in Gaul and Spain. But in Germania he met with stronger resistance. The mistrust always remained present. Germanic leaders knew that Rome promoted them as long as they were useful, and dropped them as soon as the political situation changed. Romans, on the other hand, saw the tribes as unreliable partners who could change sides at any time. This fragile relationship turned the region into a powder keg that could explode at any time. An example of this area of tension was the role of Arminius, the later leader of the Germanic tribes in the Battle of Varus. He embodied the dichotomy between friendship and enmity in an almost dramatic way. Raised as a Roman officer, awarded citizenship, and yet firmly rooted in his Cheruscan origins. His person reflected the entire ambivalence of the Roman-Germanic relationship. For the simple tribesmen, Rome was often a distant power that interfered in life but was not really part of their world. They met the Roman soldiers on rivers, in camps, or during tribute payments. They saw the shining armor, the disciplined order, and at the same time felt the arrogance of a power that felt superior. This resulted in fascination on the one hand, and hatred on the other. The Romans, on the other hand, underestimated the importance of freedom and honor in Germanic thought. They believed that lasting loyalty could be gained through gifts and contracts. But the Germanic tribes were accustomed to keeping their alliances flexible. What was true yesterday could be outdated tomorrow. For Rome, which relied on solid structures, this unpredictability was difficult to grasp. Thus, the relationship between Rome and the Germanic tribes walked a fine line. Friendship was possible, often even fruitful. But mistrust was always lurking, and submission was rarely accepted voluntarily. This mixture of closeness and distance, exchange and rejection created the conditions under which a man like Arminius could bring the tribes together in a common rebellion. On the eve of the Battle of Varus, this relationship was more tense than ever. Rome believed that Varus had created a stable order, while the Germanic tribes were less and less willing to accept the interventions. Friendship had become a facade behind which mistrust grew, and the submission that Rome considered complete was in truth only superficial. Inside, things were seething, ready to erupt in a huge eruption that was to shake the power of Rome to its foundations. Chapter 4: Arminius, the prince's son between two worlds. Arminius, the name that was to go down in history, stood at the crossroads of two worlds in the year 9 AD. Born as the son of a Cheruscan prince, he grew up in a society marked by pride in his own freedom and by life in the middle of the forests of Germania. But at a young age, he was taken to Rome, where he became acquainted with a very different world. The power and splendor of the empire, the discipline of its legions, and the political subtleties of a culture that saw itself as superior. This double coinage made Arminius a unique figure, half Roman, half German, a man who knew the knowledge and structures of the empire and yet remained true to his own origins at heart. The practice of bringing hostages or sons of tribal chieftains to Rome was a tried and tested tool of Roman politics. On the one hand, this ensured the loyalty of the fathers, and on the other hand, the young men were trained in the Roman spirit and hoped to make them allies. Arminius was also brought to Italy in this way. There he learned Latin, received lessons in rhetoric, politics, and the art of war, and was introduced to the world of Roman values. For Rome, he was a successful example of barbarization, a stranger who was molded into a Roman. His education led him to the ranks of the Roman army. Arminius served as an officer in the auxiliary troops and through bravery and skill acquired Roman citizenship as well as the rank of knight, which accepted him into the ranks of the Roman elite. In this he differed from many other Germanic princes' sons. He was not only an ally, but a fully integrated part of the system. He fought in the provinces, learned the tactics of the legions, how their discipline worked, and the value of Roman organization. All this made him an expert on the system that he would later fight so effectively. But two identities have always lived in Arminius. On the one hand, the young knight who took part in the glamorous festivals of Rome, shone in Roman weapons and mastered the language of the elites. On the other hand, the Cherusci, who came from the forests of Germania, whose heart remained true to the customs and values of his people. For the Romans, he was a model German, proof that it was possible to make useful and loyal servants out of the barbarians. To his fellow tribesmen, he was one who knew the power and means of the enemy, and perhaps someone who could use this knowledge to defend the freedom of Germania. The sources portray Arminius as clever, ambitious, and charismatic. He was not only a warrior, but also a gifted orator who knew how to win men over with words and deeds. This ability was crucial, because the Germanic tribes were not easy to unite. They knew no central authority, but only followed those who convinced them through bravery, generosity, or charismatic charisma. Arminius combined all these qualities. He was young, full of energy, but at the same time experienced in the art of war, familiar with the power of Rome and able to inspire his fellow tribesmen. His relationship with Rome was ambivalent. On the one hand, he was part of the Roman world. On the other hand, he experienced the arrogance with which Romans looked down on Germanic tribes. He knew that Rome did not see the tribes as equal partners, but as subjects who were to pay tribute and obey orders. It may have been this experience that made him decide to abandon the role of loyal ally and defend the freedom of his people. Some historians suspect that personal insults or political setbacks made him an opponent of Rome. The only thing that is certain is that he had the unique ability to unite the tribes in resistance, something that hardly anyone had managed to do before him. When Arminius returned to Germania, he was outwardly a Roman officer, but inwardly he began to plan the uprising. He used his friendship with Varus, the Roman governor, to gain trust, while at the same time forging alliances in secret. Here the whole sophistication of his character was revealed. He played the role of the loyal ally so convincingly that Varus did not suspect anything, while in the background he swore the Germanic princes to strike a common blow. His knowledge of Roman tactics, his experience as an officer, and his sense of the mentality of his fellow tribesmen made him a key figure in the drama to come. Arminius embodied the tension between submission and freedom, between integration and resistance. For Rome, he was an example of how barbarians could be inserted into the order of the empire. But in truth, he was the exact opposite, proof that the loyalty of free men could not be bought. His training had made him not a devoted servant, but the most dangerous opponent Rome had ever had in this region. The significance of his decision to turn against Rome only became apparent in the catastrophe of the Battle of Varus. But even before that, it became clear that Arminius was more than an ordinary tribal leader. He was a man who knew two worlds, who understood their strengths and weaknesses, and who was able to use this knowledge. In it, the martial energy of Germania was combined with the tactical knowledge of Rome. This mixture made him a figure who could decide the fate of entire legions. Arminius is thus not only a historical figure, but a symbol. It stands for the ambivalence of cultural encounters, for the possibility of adaptation turning into resistance, and for the power of an individual to change the course of history through charisma and determination. As the son of a prince between two worlds, he grew up as a knight in Rome, but in the forests of Germania he became the leader of a revolt that brought Rome to its borders. Chapter 5, Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman governor in Germania. Publius Quinctilius Varus is one of those figures in history whose name will forever be associated with a catastrophe. In Roman sources, he appears as a tragic general who had the trust of Emperor Augustus, but suffered a defeat in the forests of Germania that marked not only his own end, but also the limits of Roman expansion. But before he went down in history as the man who lost 3 legions, Varus had already had a remarkable career. He was not an insignificant provincial official, but an experienced politician and administrator who moved in the highest circles of Rome and had been chosen by the emperor himself for a central task. Varus came from a respected family of the senatorial class. He was connected to the imperial family by marriage and thus enjoyed great prestige in Rome. His career took him early on to political offices, which led him to administration and finally to military commands. He is best known for his time as governor of Syria, a rich and complicated province where he was tasked with collecting taxes and maintaining order. There he gained the reputation of a man who acted with iron severity when it came to suppressing uprisings or enforcing taxes. In Syria, Varus had the opportunity to prove his administrative skills, but also his inclination to assert Roman authority without compromise. Some sources accuse him of being insatiable in financial matters and of demanding high tributes to fill the coffers of the empire. Although this brought him criticism, it also showed that in the eyes of the emperor he was a reliable executor of the Roman order. Augustus trusted him because he knew that Varus would have no regard for local traditions when it came to securing the rule of Rome. When Augustus decided to turn Germania into a province, Varus seemed to be the right man for the job. He was supposed to enforce the Roman order in a country that had previously only been loosely subjugated. His task was to introduce laws, secure tribute payments, and accustom the Germanic tribes to Roman administration. It was clear that he had to reckon with mistrust and resistance. But Augustus relied on Varus' experience and toughness. He believed that with a man like him, he could permanently integrate the Germanic tribes into the Roman order. Varus took office with the attitude he had already shown in Syria: Rome stood above everything, and the subjugated had to learn to adapt. For the Germanic tribes, however, who were used to freedom and independence, this attitude seemed arrogant and provocative. When Varus pronounced justice, it was according to Roman law, not according to the traditions of the tribes. When he demanded tributes, he did so with the matter-of-factness of a man who did not take resistance seriously. For him, Germania was not a dangerous border region, but a future province whose incorporation was only a matter of time. This self-confidence was also his greatest weakness. Varus trusted in the apparent loyalty of Germanic leaders such as Arminius, whom he regarded as friends and allies. He valued their followers highly and believed that they had been educated in the Roman sense and were therefore reliable partners. He had no idea that Arminius was secretly forging a network of alliances to overthrow the Romans. He saw in him the ideal mediator between Rome and the tribes, a Germanic officer with Roman citizenship who would secure the future of the province. The sources disagree on how Varus' personality is to be evaluated. Some describe him as a capable but gullible official who did not understand the nature of the Germanic tribes. Others portray him as arrogant and self-confident, as a man who considered foreigners inferior and therefore blindly fell into the trap. Probably the truth lies in between. Varus was a typical representative of the Roman elite, shaped by the awareness of belonging to a superior culture and convinced that the military and political power of Rome was unshakable. As governor, Varus led 3 legions, auxiliary troops, and numerous companions, including families, merchants, and servants. This entourage was not only a military formation, but also a symbol of the spread of the Roman way of life. The presence of civilians shows that Varus assessed the situation so confidently that he did not expect a serious uprising. For him, it was a matter of course that Rome could also establish its order in the deep forests of Germania. It is tragic that Varus placed his trust in his Germanic allies until the end. When Arminius convinced him in 9 AD to lead a contingent for an alleged revolt in the interior of Germania, Varus saw no danger in this. He took up the march, accompanied by his legions and a long entourage. He was not aware that he was falling directly into a trap. His confidence in Arminius, combined with the conviction that no Germanic tribe could seriously stand against Rome, blinded him to the signs of impending catastrophe. The picture that the story of Varus paints is that of a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had experience, toughness, and closeness to the emperor, but all this was of no use to him in a country that did not want to submit to the Romans. His tragic end, suicide in the face of defeat, made him a symbolic figure for the limits of Roman power. For Augustus, the news came as a shock, and the words "Varus, give me back my legions," went down in tradition as an expression of despair. Varus remains an ambivalent figure. He was not an incompetent fool, as some portrayals portray him, but a representative of an imperial policy that believed that it could fit everything and everyone into the order of Rome. But it was precisely this conviction that blinded him to the independence and the will to resist of the Germanic tribes. His fate is inextricably linked to the defeat that forever inscribed his name in history. Chapter 6. The political situation on the Rhine around 9 AD. The years around 9 AD were a time of external stability and internal tension for the Roman Empire at the same time. After decades of civil wars, Augustus had consolidated the empire and established himself as the undisputed ruler. Rome seemed to be at the height of its power. The borders stretched from Spain to Syria, from North Africa to the wild landscapes north of the Alps. But it was precisely on these outermost edges of the empire, on the Rhine and the Danube, that the fragility of order became apparent. Here, in contact with the Germanic tribes, the situation was more uncertain than it might have appeared in Rome. The most important border fortresses were located on the Rhine. Legions were stationed in Mogontiacum, today's Mainz, in Vetera near Xanten and in other camps along the river. They formed the buffer zone that was supposed to protect Gaul, which had been firmly in Roman hands since Caesar's time, against Germanic raids. From here, Roman generals regularly undertook expeditions deep into the interior of Germania. The aim was to extend the empire to the Elbe in order to create a clearer and more defensible border. Politically, the project seemed promising. Several tribes had submitted to the Romans or at least formed alliances. Among them were the Cherusei, the Bructerians, and parts of the Marsians. They delivered hostages, paid tributes, and accepted the jurisdiction of the Roman governor. These arrangements gave Rome the appearance of control, even if the ties were mostly weak and burdened by mistrust. For many Germanic leaders, the alliance with Rome was above all a means of securing advantages in the competition with neighboring tribes. Loyalty was not to Rome per se, but to its own interests. In this mixed situation, the Rhine played a double role. It was a border and a bridge at the same time. For the Romans, it was the symbol of civilization that stretched from Gaul to its western shore. Beyond that, the Barbaricum began, a world of wilderness and disorder that had to be conquered. At the same time, the Rhine was a trade route and connecting line through which goods, ideas, and people circulated between the two worlds. Roman merchants brought wine, glass, and ceramics to the villages of Germania, while Germanic warriors were accepted into the Roman armies as auxiliary troops. The military situation on the Rhine was tense. Although several legions were ready, the length of the border and the vastness of Germania made permanent control difficult. In addition, the empire was deployed on many fronts at the same time. Troops had to be tied up in Illyria, on the Danube, in Syria, and in North Africa. The forces available in Germania were hardly sufficient to permanently occupy such a huge area. Augustus and his advisors knew about this problem, but they hoped that a combination of military presence and political integration would stabilize the situation. In addition, Augustus himself had to maintain a delicate balance in Rome. His rule was secure, but the political culture was characterized by mistrust. He had to keep up the appearance that the old republican institutions continued to exist, even if he ruled as a de facto monarch. Major military defeats could have jeopardized his prestige and emboldened opponents in the Senate. For this reason, it was of central importance to him that Germania policy had a successful effect. Varus, whom he appointed as governor, was to underpin this image with order and discipline. But the mood in Germania was anything but peaceful. Many tribes had only reluctantly accepted Roman supremacy. They saw the new laws, the tributes, and the encroachments on their traditional structures as a threat to their freedom. The Roman practice of pronouncing sentences according to their own law and collecting tributes without regard to local conditions increased tensions. Especially for the free peasants and warriors, it was hard to bear that they could no longer live according to their own rules. While some elites benefited from the alliance with Rome, resentment grew in the lower classes. At the same time, internal rivalries between the tribes fueled mistrust. Some leaders hoped to expand their power with Roman support, others feared the loss of their autonomy. In this inner turmoil, Arminius found the breeding ground for his plans. He knew how to channel the general discontent and appeal to the pride of the Germanic peoples. The image of the foreign ruler Varus, who placed Roman law above old habits, was an ideal image of the enemy. On the Rhine itself, this tension initially remained invisible. For the Roman legionnaires, everyday life was routine: patrols, road construction, marches through forests and meadows. For many, it was a deprivation but unspectacular service. The thought that a comprehensive uprising was being prepared behind the apparent calm did not occur to most of them. The camps were well fortified, the discipline of the legions was considered unshakable, and the experience of the previous years had shown that uprisings could be put down. The political situation on the Rhine was therefore determined by a dangerous contradiction. On the one hand, there was the impression of Roman strength and stability. Varus ruled with authority, Augustus celebrated the advances, and the elites in Rome saw the Germania project as almost complete. On the other hand, a restlessness was brewing in the depths of the country, just waiting to erupt. The Rhine was not a safe border, but a thin dam against a sea of resistance. In the year 9 AD, this tension culminated. While in Rome, Augustus enjoyed the splendor of his long reign, while the senators praised the Pax Augusta and the poets sang of Rome's triumph over the barbarians, a storm was preparing in the Germanic villages. The legions stood on the Rhine, strong and disciplined, but at the same time blind to the threat that was brewing inside the forests. This mixture of arrogance, self-confidence, and underestimated danger was the tragedy of the situation, which was soon to lead to one of the greatest disasters in Roman military history. Chapter 7. Preparing for Insurrection, Secret Alliances. While Varus ruled Germania with the confidence of a man who believed the support of his allies, Arminius began to weave a web of connections in the background that would soon decide the fate of entire legions. The uprising, which culminated in the Battle of Varus, was not a spontaneous outbreak, but the result of careful preparation, negotiations in secret and agreements made in the forests and villages of Germania, far away from the eyes and ears of the Roman occupiers. Arminius had a clear advantage. He knew the Romans, their strengths and weaknesses, and he knew how to gain their trust. As a Roman officer and ally of the administration, he was constantly close to Varus and his staff. He took part in consultations and was thus able not only to gather information, but also to dispel doubts. While he appeared in Roman uniform, he swore oath after oath at night in the clan houses of the Cherusei and their neighbors to create an alliance against Rome. He understood that the tribes alone were too weak to defeat the legions. Only by acting together, he knew, could they have a chance. The negotiations that Arminius conducted were not easy. The Germanic tribes had always been in rivalry with each other. Feuds over land, booty, and reputation were commonplace. Some tribes had benefited from the Roman alliance and saw no reason to risk everything. Others, on the other hand, were full of anger at the interventions of the Romans and were ready to give their lives in the fight for freedom. Arminius had to bring these different interests together. He appealed to the pride of the warriors, to the humiliation of Roman laws, and to the shame of allowing foreigners to impose taxes on them. His speeches are said to have been carried by a passion that convinced men who were otherwise reluctant to make their enemies allies. Arminius played particularly skillfully with the image of freedom. He portrayed the Romans not only as an external power, but as a threat to the innermost values. He knew that for the Germanic tribes, freedom was not an abstract ideal, but a concrete purpose in life, the possibility of living according to their own rules, worshipping their own gods, and deciding on their own country. If Rome took this freedom, then only the fight remained. By picking up on this feeling and reinforcing it, Arminius succeeded in overcoming the fragmentation of the tribes, at least for a short time. At the same time, he relied on secrecy and deception. The Romans were not allowed to know anything about the agreements, because even the suspicion of an uprising would have resulted in harsh retaliatory measures. So the meetings were held in secret, often in remote groves or on riverbanks, where scouts looked for Roman eyes. Oaths were sworn to weapons and gods, so that no betrayal would ruin the plans. Some tribal leaders wavered, but Arminius knew how to secure their support through personal friendship or the promise of booty. An important part of his preparation was knowledge of the terrain. Arminius knew that an open battle against the Roman legions was hopeless. Their discipline, equipment, and tactics were far superior to the uncoordinated troops of the Germanic tribes. But in the dense forests, narrow passes, and swampy lowlands, the advantages of the legions could be turned into disadvantages. Here it was not the order that counted, but the flexibility and knowledge of every hill, every path, every hidden crossing. Arminius specifically chose a terrain in which he could stretch out the Romans and smash their marching columns. Meanwhile, he remained the loyal ally in the Roman camp. He accompanied Varus, advised him, and confirmed that the situation in Germania was calm. His double game was so skillful that even experienced officers did not suspect anything. Perhaps it seemed too unlikely that a man who had Roman citizenship, was knighted and was in the service of the empire was in fact planning an uprising. It was precisely this proximity to Rome that made Arminius' betrayal so effective. The preparation of the uprising was also a logistical undertaking. Weapons had to be provided, warriors mobilized, messages exchanged between the tribes. All this happened in a society without writing, without a central organization. Word of mouth, messengers, and secret meetings formed the net that Arminius spun. The fact that nothing leaked out shows how great the loyalty of the initiates was. Betrayal could have ruined everything, but none of the participants revealed the plans to the Romans. Thus, in the years and months leading up to the battle, a silent alliance was formed, sustained by distrust of Rome and the conviction that the time had come for revolt. Arminius was not only preparing an attack, but a symbol, the blow that was to show the Romans that Germania would not be easily subdued. The alliances he forged in secret were fragile and might not have lasted long under other circumstances. But for the moment, the common enmity was enough to bring the tribes together. In Rome, no one suspected any of this. Augustus and his advisors saw Germania on its way to becoming a province. Varus trusted in the loyalty of his followers, and the legionaries marched in the conviction that the order of the empire was unshakable. No one was aware that a web of oaths and agreements was stretched in the dark forests that would soon strike. The insurrection was prepared with a thoroughness that turned the apparent balance on the Rhine into a deadly mirage. When the plans were finally ready, all that was missing was the occasion to set the Romans in motion. Arminius himself provided this occasion by telling Varus about an alleged uprising in the interior of Germania. The governor, convinced of the loyalty of his ally, led the legions into the heart of the country. This was the beginning of the final phase of preparation, in which deception and reality merged. For Arminius, the moment had come to turn the secret alliance into an open rebellion. For Varus, on the other hand, it was a step into a trap from which there should be no escape. Chapter 8. The Route of the Romans, from summer camp to the trap. The Roman legions stationed in Germania under Varus in the year 9 AD had spent the summer in their camps. These camps were starting points for patrols, road construction, and administrative tasks. For the men, summer meant a succession of marches, sentinels, field work, and occasional clashes with restless tribes. But there were no signs of a major threat. The Germanic allies, especially Arminius, reported peace in the country. Varus, convinced of his position, used the time to further consolidate Roman structures. As the summer drew to a close, it was time to retreat to the winter camps on the Rhine. Such marches were routine for the legions. They required discipline, planning, and logistical mastery, because a whole entourage of soldiers, auxiliary troops, civilians, wagons, and animals had to be moved over long distances. Usually, safe routes were chosen that were well paved and easy to control. But this time it was to be different. Arminius approached Varus and reported on an alleged revolt in the interior of Germania. Some tribes, he explained, had shaken off Roman rule and urgently needed to be brought back to order. He suggested that the legions should not be returned directly to the Rhine, but that a detour should be taken through the heart of the country in order to suppress the unrest there. For Varus, this sounded plausible. He trusted Arminius, who seemed loyal to him and whose knowledge of the place was invaluable. In addition, it corresponded to his task to immediately crush any resistance. A governor who ignored riots would have lost his authority. So Varus had the legions set up, 3 strong units, the 17th, 18th and 19th legions, plus auxiliary troops and numerous companions. Estimates assume that about 20,000 to 25,000 people formed the procession. It was not a pure military march, but a whole small company that moved. Merchants, wives, and children of officers, servants and craftsmen accompanied the columns. Wagons full of supplies and equipment slowed down the procession. This was not a light, flexible army, but a cumbersome train that depended on good roads. The route led into terrain that was unfamiliar and dangerous for the Romans. Dense forests closed, swampy lowlands made the path difficult, and rain turned the earth into mud. The legions had to move in long columns, as the terrain did not allow for wide position. Instead of orderly formation, in which Roman discipline could unfold its full effect, the soldiers were forced to march closely behind each other, often separated by the entourage of chariots and animals. That made them vulnerable. Arminius accompanied the march for a time and offered to secure the area with his own warriors as a vanguard. Varus gratefully accepted the offer, unaware that it was part of the plan. As soon as Arminius was out of sight, he began to call together the Germanic allies and position them in the prepared places. The march of the Romans thus became not only a logistical undertaking, but the entry into a trap that was carefully laid. For the legionnaires, the march was strenuous, but initially nothing unusual. Rain pattered, wagons got stuck, animals shied, and the men cursed over the morass. They had already experienced such hardships, and their discipline held them together. But they could not have known that the forests through which they passed were full of enemies watching their every step. Again and again, scouts and messengers disappeared without returning, but this seemed like a coincidence at first. No one expected a large-scale rebellion to be underway. Varus himself showed no signs of concern. He was convinced that his position was unassailable. He had 3 legions, the most powerful units in the world at that time, under his command. Even if it came to fighting, he believed he could put them down with ease. This self-confidence made him overlook the warning signs. Some Germanic tribal leaders, who were also in the Roman camp, expressed concerns, but their words fell on deaf ears. Varus considered Arminius to be loyal, and this trust determined his actions. The route was deliberately chosen. It led through an area where narrow passages, swampy depressions, and steep slopes slowed down the train and broke up order. For the Romans, it was an arduous path, for the Germanic tribes, an ideal battlefield. Here they could ambush, tear the enemy to pieces, and prevent him from developing his usual fighting strength. Every step the legions took led them deeper into the labyrinth of the trap that Arminius had laid for them. The march lasted several days, and with each day the tension grew. The soldiers were exhausted by the weather, by the endless trees, and by the feeling that something was wrong. But discipline held them together. They still believed that they were on their way to crushing a small revolt, nothing more. No one could know that they were actually marching to their doom, except Arminius and the Germanic allies who waited in the shade of the trees. When the Romans finally penetrated deeper into the rough terrain, the trap began to close. The column stretched for kilometers, the convoy was torn apart, and the soldiers no longer had the opportunity to line up in closed ranks. It was the moment Arminius had been waiting for. The march, which began as a routine, had become the prelude to a catastrophe. Varus did not lead the strongest legions of Rome back to the safety of winter camp, but into the bosom of their enemies, who were ready to destroy the greatest army in the world in the forests of Germania. Chapter 9. The beginning of the ambush, fog, rain, and forest. The columns of the Roman legions, ponderous and exhausted from the long march, moved deeper into the impassable terrain that Arminius had carefully chosen. Rain had soaked the ground, mud stuck to the soldiers' sandals, the wagons got stuck, animals stumbled and had to be driven on by force. The forests were thick, the sky was scarcely visible, and a damp cold settled on the marchers. The otherwise radiant shine of the Roman armor was covered with dirt. The discipline, which was an indomitable strength in the open field, turned into a burden. Above all, there was the impression that the country itself was against the Romans. The day the ambush began was shrouded in a grey fog. The rain fell incessantly, visibility was limited, and the forest seemed endless. It was the perfect opportunity for the Germanic tribes. They knew the terrain, they knew where paths and depressions ran, where columns would jam and where the legions could not unfold. Invisible in the trees, behind thickets and earth walls, the warriors lurked, while the Romans marched on unsuspectingly. The sounds of the forest masked the faint signs of the conspirators. The cracking of branches, the clinking of weapons, the muffled shouts of men taking up position. Varus marched at the head of his army, convinced that he was in control of the situation. Arminius had said goodbye to him shortly before, supposedly to conduct reconnaissance with his allies and to win over more warriors for the alleged use against rebels. In truth, however, he joined the hidden Germans, ready to give the signal for the attack. For Varus and his officers, he remained the loyal ally to the end, a man who was trusted without hesitation. This trust was the key that made the trap possible. As the column fought its way through a particularly narrow passage, where swampy earth slowed down the wagon train and the soldiers had little room to raise their shields, a deafening noise suddenly broke out. Horns rang from the woods, war cries echoed from the trees, and the next moment spears rained down on the Romans from all sides. The ambush was opened. The first rows of marchers were surprised, soldiers collapsed, wagons overturned, horses shied. The legionnaires, disciplined and battle-hardened, tried to form their formation, but the terrain did not allow it. The narrow path, the wet slopes and the morass made it impossible to build the typical lines of the Roman order of battle. Instead, they fought in small groups, isolated from each other, without the opportunity to play to their strengths. The Germanic tribes used the advantage of the terrain with deadly precision. They hurled spears and stones from the heights, stormed out of the undergrowth, struck and disappeared again. They did not attack in closed ranks, but in fast, flexible troops that gave the Romans no time to organize themselves. Every tree, every hill became a point of cover from which they burst forth. The Romans were faced with an enemy they could not grasp, who, like the forest itself, was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The rain intensified the chaos. The bows and sinews of the Romans were difficult to use due to the wetness, while the Germanic tribes were able to use their light weapons, spears, and clubs, without any problems. The ground was slippery, legionnaires slipped, fell into the morass with full armor and could hardly free themselves before they were slain. The cars carrying the supply got stuck and blocked the already narrow route. Panic broke out when individual parts of the column were cut off and driven into the forest. Varus tried to calm the men, he gave orders, but the screams of the wounded and the incessant drumming of the rain drowned out his voice. Officers tried to establish order, but they themselves became the target of the attacks, as the Germanic tribes recognized them and preferred to eliminate them. The soldiers fought fiercely, but the enemy was invisible and incessant. Every gap in the defense was immediately used, every weakness mercilessly exploited. Nevertheless, the legions managed to gather towards evening and set up a provisional camp. The Romans were masters at building such defensive structures, and even under the most adverse circumstances they built walls of shields, earth embankments, and wagons. Here they sought shelter, exhausted, soaked, full of wounded and dead around them. They knew now that they had not fallen into an ordinary march, but into a trap from which there was hardly any escape. There was jubilation in the ranks of the Germans. The first blow had succeeded. The Romans were wounded, demoralized, and cut off deep in the enemy country. But Arminius knew that this was only the beginning. He didn't just want to strike a blow and disappear, he wanted to destroy the legions. The ambush was designed in such a way that it could last for days, with attacks from the forest, with disruptions of the march route, and with the complete disintegration of order. The fog, the rain, and the forests were his allies, and he used them to take away any hope of salvation from the Romans. Thus began a drama in the Teutoburg Forest that did not consist of a single battle, but of a war of attrition lasting several days. The first day had shown that the Romans were vulnerable if they were deprived of their order. The second day would prove that even the strongest legions in the world could not stand up to a country that weaponized itself. Chapter 10. The first attack, surprise strikes against the column. The first day of the ambush had already shown the Romans that they were trapped, but the full extent of the disaster was revealed when the Germanic warriors intensified their attacks on the marching column. The legions, accustomed to fighting in orderly formations, were now involved in ever-new battles that robbed them of their superiority. The enemy did not come in a battle order that could be smashed with the shield wall and the disciplined phalanx, but appeared in small groups, struck at lightning speed and disappeared back into the woods. Every step forward became a fight for survival, every rest a nail-biter, whether a hail of spears would not suddenly break out of the thicket. The marching column was endlessly long, stretching for kilometers through the narrow terrain. At the very front walked the vanguard, followed by the main legions, then the huge entourage of wagons, animals, civilians, and auxiliary troops, and at the very end the rearguard, which was to secure the retreat. Normally, this structure was a guarantee of safety and overview, but in the Teutoburg Forest it became a weakness. The attacks of the Germanic tribes started exactly where the column was vulnerable, with the supply vans, with the stragglers, with the detachments that separated from each other in the morass. Particularly devastating was the fact that the enemy disrupted the rhythm of the legions. Whenever the Romans were preparing to restore their order, the Germanic tribes launched new attacks. Sometimes it was a sudden hail of spears from the slopes, sometimes a raid from a hidden path, sometimes an attack on a single contingent that had lost its way. The Romans could never be sure when and where the next blow would occur. This constant feeling of insecurity gnawed at morale. Legionnaires, accustomed to being invincible in open battle, felt helpless against an opponent who struck like a shadow. The Germanic tribes made full use of their local knowledge. They had prepared obstacles, felled trees that suddenly fell on the marchers, dug pits and blocked paths. Wagons jammed, animals shied, and in this chaos the warriors rushed out, with wild screams and full force. They deliberately sought out the gaps in the Roman ranks, killed the wounded and then withdrew before a united defense was possible. For the Romans, it was as if the forest itself was fighting against them. Varus tried to stay in control. He gave orders, sounded signals, and ordered the legions to move closer together. But the confined space made this almost impossible. Where the column had to expand to overcome obstacles, they became most vulnerable. As soon as they pushed back together, they threatened to get in each other's way. The discipline, which was an iron strength in the open field, turned into a hindrance here. The first attack had an enormous effect, especially psychologically. The Romans had fought again and again against Germanic tribes and usually defeated them, but now they experienced that their opponent did not act in open confrontation, but from ambush. The forest was full of screams, the clash of weapons echoed between the trees, and any shadow could be an enemy. The legionnaires, who were otherwise led by strict commandos, now had to fight for survival in small groups. Many lost their orientation, others separated from the main procession, and so the unity was more and more lost. For the Germans, on the other hand, it was a triumph. Every attack, every dead legionnaire, every captured sword was proof that the Romans were also vulnerable. They fought not only with weapons, but also with the knowledge that they could bring the world's greatest enemy to its knees. Their courage grew with each blow, their attacks became more ferocious and coordinated. The rain did not stop, it intensified the impression of desolation. The water soaked the clothes, made the floors slippery and difficult to pass. The Romans, who knew how to wield their shields and swords precisely in dry conditions, found themselves in a world that demanded everything from them. The Germanic tribes, on the other hand, were accustomed to this climate. They moved easily and quickly, they knew the ways and had no wagons or long convoys to burden them. When night fell, the legions were badly marked. They had suffered losses, were exhausted and full of doubts. They had not yet lost their effectiveness, Varus was still alive and the officers were with the troops, but it was clear that this march would not be like an ordinary retreat. Everyone now knew that they were in a trap from which there was no easy way out. The first attack had surprised and shaken the Romans. It had shown that the legions in the forest were not invulnerable, that their order became fragile when the enemy used the terrain for himself. For Varus and his men, it was a bitter awakening that marked the beginning of a struggle lasting several days. For Arminius and his allies, it was confirmation that their plan was working. The Roman army was no longer the overpowering ruler, it was an insecure, scattered column caught in the stranglehold of the forests. Thus ended the first day of the open attack, a day full of rain, fog, and blood. The Romans had held their ground, but the price was high, and their confidence began to wane. What they didn't know yet was that this was only the prelude. The real attrition, the slow disintegration of their order, was yet to begin, and the forests would become their grave. Chapter 11. Day 2 in the Teutoburg Forest, the army in a stranglehold. The morning of the second day in the Teutoburg Forest did not begin with hope, but with fear and exhaustion. The Romans had spent the night in a hastily erected camp, surrounded by improvised walls of earth, shields, and chariots. Rain had filled the trenches, the men had scarcely slept, and the screams of the wounded echoed through the darkness. When dusk came, everyone knew that the battle would continue, that the Germanic tribes had not disappeared, but were just waiting to strike again. The legions continued their march, but they were already marked. Discipline and order still held them together, but the long train of wagons and civilians had become a burden. Again and again, the columns had to stop to free stuck cars or to treat the wounded. The officers did their best to spur the men on, but the faces of the legionnaires were grey with fatigue, their bodies aching from the constant march in the morass. Every step cost strength, every look into the forest aroused fear of the next attack. And this attack was not long in coming. Soon another hail of spears began from the slopes. The Germans had repositioned themselves during the night and attacked with fresh courage. Their troops fell out of the forest, shouted their wild shouts, and pounced on the weakest parts of the column. Especially the entourage with wagons and supplies was their goal. They knew that the Romans could not survive without supplies, and they struck where the legionnaires were tied down by the defense of the chariots. The Romans tried to raise shields and form formations, but only fragmentarily succeeded. In the narrowness of the terrain, where the marching path led through hills and swamps, there was hardly any room for the classic battle formations. Instead, small defensive rings formed, which were besieged from all sides. The Germanic tribes struck, disappeared, returned. It was an endless cycle that wore down the Romans. Varus, who still cherished the hope of defeating the enemy, ordered that they had to march further west to reach the winter camps on the Rhine. But every kilometer became a hell of a march. The column dispersed, units lost contact, and the connection between the vanguard, the center, and the rearguard weakened. Again and again, the Germanic tribes succeeded in isolating and destroying groups. Entire cohorts disappeared into the forest without anyone ever hearing from them again. The rain intensified the misery. Soils became swamps, horses sank up to their knees, and legionnaires had to pull their comrades out of the morass. Heavy armor, which offered protection in the open field, now became a burden. Men who fell often did not get up before they were hit by Germanic spears. The auxiliary troops, many of them Germans themselves, wavered in their loyalty. Some fled, others even changed sides and attacked the Romans. The Germanic tribes also used the night not to let the Romans rest. They kept close to the camp, shouted scornful chants, blew horns, and did not let the enemy sleep. The Romans suffered from constant tension. They hardly dared to make a fire for fear of betraying the position. Every shadow, every sound made her flinch. Even the officers, accustomed to enforcing strict order, felt that their authority was crumbling. On the second day, morale began to break in earnest. Legionnaires, who had previously firmly believed in the strength of Rome, saw that their discipline did not help. They fought bravely, but they had no enemy before them that could be defeated in open battle. Instead, it was an invisible enemy striking from the forest that weaponized the rain and the terrain. The Romans felt that they were in a stranglehold. Every way out seemed closed, every attempt to restore order failed due to the circumstances. Varus himself did what he could, but his orders seemed increasingly powerless. He tried to encourage people, he sent signals, but he couldn't stop the inevitable. Some of his officers were already beginning to secretly talk about a breakthrough or even an escape. But a retreat was impossible, because the enemy was lurking everywhere. The Germanic tribes had turned the forest into a trap that closed tighter with every step. The second day was not a day of one great battle, but an endless attrition. Again and again you could hear the horns, again and again Germanic warriors rushed out of the fog, only to disappear just as quickly. It was a fight against shadows, a dying in small groups, a struggle that did not allow for victory, but only a slow decline. When darkness fell again, the Romans were more exhausted than ever. They had suffered heavy losses, their supplies were almost exhausted, and their hope was beginning to fade. They built another night's camp, but it was only a weak defense against an enemy that pursued them every hour. The forest had become a prison, the rain a constant companion, and the cries of the Germans echoed through the night like the echo of death. At the end of the second day, it was clear that the army was no longer in control of its own situation. It was in a stranglehold, forced to march in a direction dictated by Arminius and his allies. Every step the Romans took led them deeper into ruin, and the hope of reaching the Rhine faded with every hour. The second day in the Teutoburg Forest had turned a disciplined army into a demoralized mass that was still fighting, but believed less and less in salvation. Chapter 12, Day 3, The Breakdown of Order. The third day in the Teutoburg Forest began with a feeling of hopelessness. Even during the night, the Germanic tribes had not let the Romans rest. Screams, horns, and isolated attacks had kept the camp on constant alert. Men had scarcely slept, the wounded were groaning, and the rain had softened the earth, so that even the improvised ramparts could no longer hold. The legionnaires woke up soaked, hungry, and marked by fear. There were hardly any supplies left, the animals were exhausted, many wagons were abandoned. The men knew they were caught in a deadly net, and they felt their strength running out. Varus and his officers nevertheless held a last consultation. It was agreed that they had to try to continue the march, whatever the cost. The Rhine seemed inaccessible, but the hope of salvation drove her. The order was given to set off again. The column started moving, but it was hardly an orderly army anymore. What had once been 3 proud legions was now a ragged procession of exhausted men barely able to raise their shields. The discipline of which Rome was so proud dissolved. Everyone thought first of their own survival, and the formation that made up the strength of the legions was gone. The Germanic tribes immediately recognized the enemy's condition. On the third day they intensified their attacks, and they now did everything in their power to smash the remnants of the Roman order once and for all. Again and again they stormed out of the forests, attacked smaller groups, separated them from the main train and destroyed them. The mud, which made it difficult for the Romans to move, was no obstacle for the more lightly equipped Germanic tribes. They moved with astonishing speed, struck and disappeared again. The forest was their home, and it became the tomb of the Romans. What was particularly devastating was that communication between the units broke down. Signals were lost in the noise of the forest, messengers were intercepted by Germans or never arrived. So each detachment fought on its own, without knowing where the rest of the army was. Confusion spread, panic spread. Men ran without knowing where they were going, others threw away their weapons and sought shelter in the undergrowth, where they were quickly found and slain by the Germanic tribes. Varus himself tried to maintain his authority. But the situation had gotten out of control. It was said that he was wounded by one leg, which further limited his ability to give orders. His officers fought bravely, but they too were gradually eliminated. The belief in salvation vanished, and with it the last hope for order. What could still be described as an army in a stranglehold on the second day had now become a disintegrated, desperate mass. The horrors of the third day were indescribable. Legionnaires who saw their comrades die panicked. The morass was covered with corpses, wagons stood burning by the roadside, and horses that went crazy trampled down the wounded. The weather made the situation worse. Rain whipped into the faces, fog enveloped the battlefield, so that you could hardly see the next row. It was as if nature itself was fighting with the Germanic tribes against Rome. The Germanic tribes did not lose energy, but became more and more wild. Each attack brought them new loot, weapons, shields, helmets, valuable equipment. They saw that the Romans were no longer in control of the situation, and with growing courage they threw themselves upon their opponents. It was no longer a regulated battle, but a massacre in which the discipline of the legions was no longer worth anything. The sight of the entourage was particularly shocking. Women, children, servants, and merchants who had gone with the legions fell into the hands of the attackers. Many were beaten to death, others were abducted. The chaos was complete, and every attempt to protect civilians failed. The Romans had to realize that not only their military power, but also their entire presence in Germania was about to be wiped out. In the afternoon of the third day, the last order finally collapsed. Entire detachments threw away their shields and fled, only to sink into swamps or be slaughtered by the Germanic tribes. Officers tried in vain to gather the men. Even experienced veterans saw no chance. It was the moment when the proud machinery of the Roman legions finally disintegrated. An orderly army had become a desperate bunch that was running towards certain destruction. Varus, who recognized the disaster, knew that he could no longer bring salvation. His thoughts were probably directed to the Emperor Augustus and the disgrace he would suffer. But the fate of the general belongs in the next chapter. For the moment, the third day meant that the Roman order was broken, that the legions no longer existed. Germania had triumphed even before the last blade had fallen, because what Rome was all about, discipline, organization, iron order, had sunk into the mud of the Teutoburg Forest. At the end of the day, the Roman power was on the ground. The survivors wandered through the forest, without orientation, without guidance, pursued by an enemy that was unstoppable. The third day had shown that even the strongest army of antiquity could be brought to its knees in an enemy country, under adverse weather and against an opponent who understood the terrain. The catastrophe had become inevitable, and the end was clearly on the horizon. Chapter 13. The end of the Battle of Varus, destruction and suicide of the general. The third day had brought the Roman legions to the brink of collapse, and when the morning of the fourth day dawned, the last will to resist was almost extinguished. The soldiers who were still able to march were exhausted, soaked, and starving. The ranks were torn, discipline shattered, and many men had long since lost their shields, helmets, or swords. The wounded were left behind, as no one had the strength to carry them. What had once set out as an orderly army now consisted of a scattered crowd marked by fear and despair. The Germanic tribes felt that the hour of final victory had come. Arminius spurred on his warriors, and they now attacked with even greater force. They knew that the enemy was at the end of his rope. Their raids became a constant flood that did not allow for any recovery. Wherever Romans tried to regroup, the Germanic force broke over them. Spears crackled, swords flashed, and warriors rushed out from all directions. It was no longer a fight, but a massacre. Varus, the governor, recognized the hopelessness of the situation. His duty had been to secure order, to make Germania a province, and to bring triumph to the Emperor Augustus. Now he was faced with the complete annihilation of his army. The legions entrusted to him could no longer be saved. The knowledge of having led 3 entire legions to their downfall must have weighed heavily on him. It is said that in view of certain doom, he decided to take his own life. Whether he did this to avoid falling into the hands of the enemy, or whether it was the disgrace he could not bear, remains uncertain. But his death sealed the fate of the campaign. With the death of their general, the Romans lost the last remnant of leadership. Although some officers continued to fight bravely, trying to gather men and resist in orderly formation, they were quickly overwhelmed. Individual groups that fled into the forests were persecuted and slaughtered by the Germanic tribes. Some sought rescue in swamps and moors, but there they sank or were found. Only a few escaped, and these survivors would later carry the news of the catastrophe to the west. The battle did not end with a clear signal, but with the complete disintegration of the Roman army. Everywhere in the forest lay dead, broken weapons and scattered equipment. Wagons stood burning along the road, animals wandered around ownerless, and the ground was soaked with the blood of countless men. The 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, ceased to exist. Their standards, the sacred symbols of Roman honor, fell into the hands of the Germanic tribes. For Rome, this was an immeasurable loss, not only militarily, but also symbolically. The Germanic tribes took no prisoners, at least not in the conventional sense. Many Romans were killed in a cruel way, others were offered as sacrifices to the gods. Archaeological finds suggest that men were laid down in bogs, perhaps as a sign of gratitude to the powers that had made victory possible. For the Germanic tribes, this was not only a military triumph, but a sacred act that affirmed their freedom and independence. For the few survivors who reached the Rhine, the site of the battlefield must have remained in the memory forever. They had seen how the world's greatest military power had been destroyed in the forests of Germania, not by open battle, but by cunning, terrain, and the irrepressible will of the tribes. They carried the news to the west, and with it the image of total defeat. The end of the Battle of Varus was not only the destruction of an army, but also a turning point in history. Never before had Rome suffered such a defeat that cost not only soldiers but also a governor and confidence in the invincible order of the empire. Varus's suicide was a symbol of this catastrophe. A man who could no longer bear responsibility, who evaded the ignominy, but at the same time confirmed the despair of the situation by his death. The Germanic tribes, on the other hand, celebrated. They had defeated the enemy who seemed invincible. Their courage had been rewarded, their freedom secured. But the victory was also bloodily bought, and the dangers were not averted, for they knew that Rome would strike back one day. For the moment, however, the country was filled with jubilation over victory, with pride in having brought the greatest power of antiquity to its knees. This is how the Battle of Varus ended, With rain, fog, and blood, with the destruction of 3 legions, with the death of their commander, and with the triumph of the Germanic tribes that was to change the history of Europe forever. Chapter 14. The Germanic victors, booty, revenge, and freedom. With the collapse of the Roman legions and the death of the governor Varus, the Germanic revolt was not only successful, but of a scope that the tribes had hardly ever experienced before. For the first time, they had managed not only to beat back the greatest military power of their time in a decisive battle, but to completely destroy it. This victory was not the work of a single group, but the result of a rare unity among the Germanic tribes who, under the leadership of Arminius, had risen up against the common enemy. Now that the guns had fallen silent, a mixture of triumph, revenge, and liberation broke through. For the warriors, victory was not only an act of defense, but also a source of rich booty. On the battlefield lay countless weapons, armor, and equipment such as most Germans had never seen before. Roman swords, helmets, shields, and intricately crafted armor were collected, not only as trophies, but also as valuable tools for future battles. Many of these weapons passed into the hands of the victors, others were deposited in sanctuaries to honor the gods for their assistance. The bodies of the fallen presented a different picture. A sea of the dead, Roman legionnaires and their companions, stretching over the swampy floors and through the forests. For the Germanic tribes, this was not only the result of a battle, but a sign that their freedom had been bought and secured with blood. But the treatment of the fallen was merciless. Many Romans who were still alive were slain or sacrificed to the gods. The Germanic religion demanded signs of gratitude in moments of great victory, and so human sacrifices were found among the captives, which were offered to the gods in swamps or in holy places. At the same time, the victory was an opportunity for revenge. Many tribes had suffered under the rule of the Romans. They had paid tributes, seen their own laws suppressed, and had been humiliated when Roman officials tried them. Now the opportunity had come to pay back all this. Those Romans who were taken prisoner were hit particularly hard. There was no pity for them, only the hatred of a people who rebelled against decades of oppression. Stories tell that some prisoners were cruelly executed, as a reflection of the harshness with which Rome had previously ruled over the tribes. But in addition to revenge and sacrifices, the victory was also a celebration of freedom. The warriors who had participated in the victory returned to their villages, filled with pride and prestige. For them, participation in this battle meant not only personal glory, but also the elevation of their entire clan. A man who had fought and survived against the Romans was held in the highest esteem. Songs and stories were sung that glorified victory, and the names of those who had fallen bravely were honored in the meetings. Arminius himself was at the center of the triumph. He had accomplished the impossible, the unification of the tribes and the destruction of the Romans. For many, he was not just a warrior, but a liberator who had restored the independence of the Germanic tribes. His prestige grew immeasurably, and he became a symbol of freedom. But with this glory came the burden of responsibility, for while the tribes were united in victory, their old rivalries and self-interests remained. The victory also had a deeper religious meaning. Many Germanic tribes were convinced that their gods had tipped the scales. Dana, Woden, and Tiwaz, who stood for war, strength, and order, must have stood by the fighters, it was believed. Sanctuaries were decorated with the captured weapons, and priestesses and seers interpreted the victory as a sign that the gods had wanted the freedom of their people. In this interpretation, the Battle of Varus was not only a military event, but a sacred confirmation of Germanic identity. For the tribes, the victory also meant a new starting position. They had proven that Rome was not invincible. But the question was how long this triumph would last. Many knew that Rome was an empire that did not simply accept defeat. But for the moment, the feeling of invincibility prevailed. Men, women, and children celebrated, villages were filled with festivals, and the wealth from booty spread widely. The image of the Romans had also changed. For decades, they had been feared and respected, as masters of a world power whose armies brought down even kings. But now they had fallen, slain in the woods, their standards conquered, their general dead. This image nourished the pride of the Germanic tribes and made them believe that their freedom was secured forever. But even in this moment of triumph, the shadow of the future hovered over the tribes. They were aware that Rome would return one day, with renewed anger and greater power. Some voices called for preparation for this inevitable retribution, others hoped that Rome would leave Germania alone forever through the shock of the loss. The truth was somewhere in between. For the present, however, the victory over Varus was an event of incomparable importance. Spoils were distributed, revenge was taken, and freedom was assured. The Germanic tribes had fought for their place in history, not as defeated barbarians, but as peoples who had resisted and triumphed against a world power. Chapter 15. The news reaches Rome, shock and grief under Augustus. When the first survivors of the Battle of Varus reached the Rhine, they brought news with them that sounded so unbelievable that many did not want to believe it at first. 3 whole legions were said to have been destroyed in the forest of Germania, the governor dead, the standards lost, and no orderly army left. In an empire that believed in its invincibility, such a disaster was hardly imaginable. But the more survivors arrived, the more reports intensified, the clearer it became that the catastrophe was real. Germania had dealt Rome a blow the likes of which had not been seen for centuries. The news was carried to Rome, and when it reached the Emperor Augustus, the reaction was marked by despair. The aging ruler, who had fought all his life for order and stability, suddenly saw his life's work threatened. He had pacified the empire, secured the borders, and created the image of a Pax Augusta, an era of peace and strength. Now he was faced with the loss of 3 legions, one of his experienced governors, and the belief in the superiority of Rome. The sources report that Augustus, when he heard the news, fell into a state of deepest grief and shock. The words that he cried out in desperation are handed down: "Varus, give me back my legions." An exclamation that describes the force of the catastrophe like no other. The emperor's grief was more than a personal lament over the loss of a friend or ally. It reflected the fear that the foundations of his rule could begin to falter. Augustus knew that Rome's authority was not based solely on military strength, but on the belief in its imperturbability. The Battle of Varus was more than a defeat, it was a symbol that even Rome was vulnerable. At a time when the image of the emperor had to appear sacrosanct, this was a dangerous revelation. The news also caused shock and bewilderment among the population of Rome. People were accustomed to hearing of victories, of triumphal processions in which generals led the riches of conquered countries through the streets. Now the news of death, destruction, and disgrace reached them. Entire families lost sons, fathers, and brothers. The 3 legions that had been wiped out consisted not only of anonymous soldiers, but of men from Italy, Gaul, and the provinces, whose fate was now sealed in the forests of Germania. The grief mixed with fear. Would the Germanic tribes now push across the Rhine? Was Gaul in danger? Was even Rome itself threatened? Augustus reacted with the utmost seriousness. Measures were immediately taken to secure the Rhine front. New troops were raised, reserves were mobilized, and the border fortifications were strengthened. The emperor was aware that any appearance of weakness could provoke new uprisings, not only in Germania, but also in other parts of the empire. At the same time, the humiliation was so great that it was not possible to simply go back to business as usual. The defeat had to be processed, both militarily and psychologically. In the circles of the Senate and the elite, there was a heated discussion about how this catastrophe could have happened. Some blamed Varus, his arrogance, and blindness to the intrigues of the Germanic tribes. Others saw the cause in the general attempt to subjugate a country like Germania, whose resilience had been underestimated. Still others feared that the defeat was a sign of divine disgrace, a warning that Rome had overstepped its borders. For Augustus, it was crucial not to let the defeat become a political disaster. He was a master of self-promotion, but this time no propaganda, no triumphal procession helped. Instead, he resorted to the power of grief and determination. He did not show himself in public as a broken man, but as an emperor who, despite pain and loss, had the strength to hold the empire together. But inside him, the Battle of Varus gnawed at him. The sources report that he was still plagued by nightmares years later in which he summoned the lost legions. The grief under Augustus was also personal, because Varus was more than just an official. He was related by marriage to the imperial family, belonged to the close circle of confidants, and his death affected Augustus not only as a ruler, but also as a human being. But in the logic of the empire, there was no room for long lamentation. Germania had to be reassessed as a threat, and the military response was not long in coming. The news of the defeat also had an impact beyond the borders. In the provinces of the empire, in Gaul and in Pannonia, it was seen with concern that Rome was not invincible. Some peoples, who had hitherto bowed to the power of the empire, began to consider whether resistance was not possible after all. The shock of Germania acted as a signal. The empire was not omnipotent. But for the moment, the focus remained on Augustus and his immediate reaction. In Rome, funeral services were held, sacrifices were made to the gods, and interpretations of this misfortune were sought. Was it a mistake in politics? Was it the fault of a single man? Or was it a fate that even Rome could not avert? All these questions hovered over the city as Augustus himself, in quiet desperation, demanded the return of his legions, knowing full well that they would never return. The news of the Battle of Varus was thus more than a message about a military catastrophe. It was a shock for the entire empire, a moment of mourning for the emperor, a trauma for the population, and a beacon for the future. Augustus' pain and his desperate words still reflect the force of this event, which shattered the illusion of invincibility and forced Rome to reconsider its borders. Chapter 16. The Roman Reaction, Germanicus and the Punitive Expeditions. The news of the Battle of Varus was a blow that shook Rome, but the empire was not willing to accept the disgrace without a fight. Augustus himself was too old to lead an army into battle again, but he knew that a decisive response was needed. Not only did the Rhine front have to be stabilized, but the honor of the lost legions also demanded retribution. In the following years, therefore, comprehensive measures were taken to reassert Roman power in Germania. It was not only military necessity that drove Rome, but also the urge to heal the psychological wound that the defeat had torn. First of all, the border on the Rhine had to be secured. New legions were raised, reserves were mobilized, and the cities in Gaul prepared themselves for emergencies. There was a real danger that the Germanic tribes would invade the Roman provinces after their victory over Varus. But this danger did not materialize. The Germanic tribes had won a triumphant victory, but they were not a united people with central command that could have led a coordinated offensive. After the victory, they dispersed back to their tribal territories, laden with booty, and celebrated their freedom. This gave Rome the necessary breathing space. In the following years, Tiberius, the adopted son of Augustus, took on the task of stabilizing the situation on the Rhine. He led several campaigns, but they were mainly defensive in nature. The aim was not to immediately penetrate deep into Germania, but to secure the empire and consolidate the loyalty of the Gallic provinces. Tiberius acted cautiously. He did not want to risk another disaster. But the need for retribution remained, and after Augustus' death, this task passed to his successor. The young emperor Tiberius relied on his nephew Germanicus, a popular general who was endowed with charisma, courage, and military skill. Germanicus knew how to bind the soldiers to himself. He aroused in them enthusiasm and the desire to erase the shame of Varus. In the years 14 to 16 AD, he led several major campaigns on the other side of the Rhine. These expeditions were not only military operations, but also symbolic acts. They were intended to show that Rome still had the power to punish its enemies and reclaim lost ground. Germanicus led his troops deep into the enemy country. He destroyed villages, devastated fields, and set fire to Germanic settlements. The message was clear: anyone who challenged Rome had to reckon with merciless retaliation. But the campaigns were not only for destruction. Germanicus also wanted to restore control of the country and, above all, to regain the standards of the lost legions. These standards were symbols of Roman honor, and their loss in the Battle of Varus was an open wound. The retrieval of these banners was to show that Rome had overcome its disgrace. A highlight of these campaigns was the Battle of the so-called Long Bridges and the confrontation on the Weser. Germanicus was able to achieve several victories and proved that the Roman army was still a formidable force even after Varus. Particularly impressive was the moment when he visited the site of the Varus battle himself. There he had the fallen legionnaires buried, whose bones were still scattered in the fields. For the soldiers who followed him, this was a sacred ritual. It was not only a military act, but a moral duty to pay their last respects to the fallen and to transform the ignominy of their demise into a sign of Roman loyalty and remembrance. But as successful as Germanicus was on the battlefield, the situation in Germania remained difficult. The land was impassable, the tribes unpredictable, and any conquest could only be secured by a constant presence. Germanicus himself urged to advance further and strive for the complete subjugation of Germania. But Emperor Tiberius, who was more cautious and sober, recognized the limits of this enterprise. He feared that Germanicus could gain too much popularity through two great victories and thus become a danger to his own rule. Eventually, Germanicus was recalled, and plans for a permanent conquest of Germania were abandoned. Nevertheless, the punitive expeditions served their purpose. They restored the balance. They showed the Germanic tribes that Rome was still capable of sending huge armies into their country, and they consolidated Roman control of the Rhine. The recovery of the standards was also a moral victory that was celebrated in Rome. The memory of the disgrace of Varus remained, but it was mitigated by the victories of Germanicus. Rome's reaction to the Battle of Varus was thus twofold. On the one hand, marked by pain, grief, and the awareness that Germania could not be completely subjugated, but on the other hand, by a demonstration of unbroken strength. Germanicus became a hero, a symbol of the Roman response to the catastrophe. His campaigns marked the point at which Rome did not forget the defeat, but inserted it into its history, not as a final defeat, but as a lesson and as an occasion to recognize its own borders anew. Thus, the Roman reaction to the Battle of Varus was ultimately a compromise between revenge and realism. Rome struck back, it restored its honor, but at the same time it accepted that the Rhine remained the natural border of the empire. The punitive expeditions of Germanicus were not the beginning of a new expansion, but the end of a dream, the dream of completely integrating Germania into the order of Rome. Chapter 17. Archaeological Traces, Calcrease and the Battlefield. For centuries, the Battle of Varus was an event described by historians, glorified by poets and recorded by chroniclers, but the exact battlefield remained a mystery for a long time. Ancient sources reported on the Teutoburg Forest, but this name was vague in its geographical scope and left the place in the dark. It was only the archaeological research of the last decades that brought clarity, and with the site of Calcrease in the Osnabrück region, the certainty became more pronounced that the catastrophe of the Roman legions had taken its course here. The first clues came in the 19th century, when individual coin finds and reports pointed to a possible battlefield. But it was not until the 1980s that systematic excavations began and a wealth of evidence was found that could hardly be interpreted in any other way. Roman coins with the coins of Varus, military equipment, helmets, chain mail, lance points, remains of armor and even personal belongings of legionnaires appeared from the earth. They were not randomly scattered, but arranged in a way that indicated a massive battle. Particularly striking were the remains of a long rampart that ran across the landscape. These ramparts, built of earth and wood, apparently served the Germanic tribes as an ambush from which they attacked the marching Romans. The discovery of this complex matched exactly with the ancient descriptions according to which the Germanic tribes had worked with prepared obstacles and entrenchments. The wall of Calcrease thus became one of the most conclusive proofs that the core of the battle must have taken place here. In addition to weapons and military equipment, the archaeologists also came across harrowing remains of human bones. Skulls with cuts and stab wounds, smashed jaws, bones that had been buried in pits or lay open in the fields testified to the cruelty of the events. The chaotic arrangement indicated that many of the fallen had initially been left lying and only years later buried by the troops of Germanicus. The traces confirmed what the sources reported, that the Roman dead had remained unburied for a long time, an image of horror that must have deeply marked the survivors. Particularly impressive was the discovery of equipment that told a personal story. Roman helmets, some of which were ornately decorated with impacts of Germanic weapons, chain mail whose links were pierced, swords that were broken and thrown away. Small objects such as fibulae, coins, tools and jewelry also came to light. They told of the people who had lost their lives here and gave the anonymous mass death an individual dimension. The coin finds were of particular value, as they allowed a chronological classification. Many of them bore the image of Varus and came from the years immediately before the battle. This made it clear that the finds were not here by chance, but were directly linked to the fall of the legions. Such evidence created a clear picture. Calcrease was not just any place, but the battlefield where the catastrophe reached its climax. The topography of the site also fits seamlessly into the descriptions of the ancient springs. Calcrease lies on a narrow corridor between a ridge and a moor. It is precisely such a terrain that the historian Cassius Dio describes when he describes how the Romans were ambushed in bottlenecks and swamps. The combination of swampy ground, dense forests, and limited space made it nearly impossible to keep a marching army in formation. For the Romans, the path became a trap, for the Germanic tribes the ideal battlefield. The archaeological work in Calcrease has not yet been completed. Again and again, new finds come to light that refine the picture and bring further details to light. Numerous remains of horse harnesses, chains and nails were discovered, which indicate the mass presence of wagons and mounts. All this confirms the tradition that the legions were traveling with large luggage and an unwieldy train that was their undoing. The question of how the Germanic tribes dealt with the dead and the booty after the battle is also answered by archaeological traces. Some finds indicate that certain objects were deliberately destroyed or sacrificed. Weapons were broken, jewelry was bent, and some objects apparently ended up in cultic deposition. This fits with the reports that the Germanic tribes also understood victory as a religious event and dedicated booty to the gods. Today, Calcrease is not only an archaeological site, but also a symbol. The museum and the excavation sites set up there make the dimension of the battle visible. Visitors can see the ramparts, see the legionnaires' equipment, and imagine what the site looked like 2,000 years ago. Calcrease combines history and archaeology, myth and reality. It shows that the Battle of Varus is not a mere report from old chronicles, but a real, tangible event whose traces reach into the present. Thus, the excavations of Calcrease have closed a gap in history. They have shown where the catastrophe reached its climax, and they have given the reports of antiquity a solid foundation. The bones, the coins, the weapons, they are silent witnesses of one of the greatest dramas of antiquity. They remind us that not only armies met here, but that tens of thousands of people lost their lives, caught between duty, cunning, and the relentless will of the Germanic tribes. Chapter 18. The Battle in the Memory of the Romans, Fear and Propaganda. The Battle of Varus left a scar in Rome's collective memory that went deeper than many other defeats before. Rome had suffered bitter setbacks in its long history. The plundering by the Gauls, defeats against Carthage, or the battles against the Parthians. But what happened in the Teutoburg Forest had a special quality. 3 whole legions had not only been defeated, but extinguished, their standards in the hands of the enemy, their commander dead, and all this not in a distant empire, but only a few days' march from their own imperial frontier. The awareness of this catastrophe shaped the Roman psyche for generations. At first, fear dominated. The people in Gaul and on the Rhine lived in fear that the Germanic tribes would use their victory and push westwards. In Rome itself, the idea that the barbarians could threaten the heart of the empire was exaggerated, but the unrest was real. Emperor Augustus, who had cultivated the image of stability and peace throughout his life, saw this image shattered. His despair was not only personal, but an expression of a collective panic that spread throughout the empire. This fear was reflected in the writings of historians. Cassius Dio and Velleius Paterculus described the battle with a mixture of horror and fascination. Tacitus, the later chronicler, placed the Battle of Varus in a larger context, as proof that the Germanic tribes were an indomitable people, wild, untamed, and at the same time noble in their desire for freedom. The defeat thus became more than a military event, it became a moral lesson. From then on, Germania appeared as a country that eluded Roman civilization, a place where even the strongest legions were bound to fail. But fear alone could not be a lasting narrative. Rome knew how to turn even defeats into propaganda. Even the punitive expeditions of Germanicus served not only military retaliation, but also psychological reappraisal. The repatriation of the captured legionary eagles was an act of enormous symbolic importance. The lost symbols of honor were brought home, and thus it could be announced in Rome that the disgrace had been at least partially erased. In the official account, Varus soon became the central figure of failure. He was blamed for the catastrophe. His gullibility towards Arminius, his inability to recognize the danger, his rigid attitude as governor. By reducing the defeat to the misconduct of an individual, the reputation of the Roman army as a whole could be protected. The legions had not been weak, so the message went, but a man had led them to their doom. This narrative helped restore confidence in the military strength of the empire. At the same time, an image of the Germanic tribes emerged that fluctuated between fear and admiration. They were portrayed as savage, barbaric peoples who lived without cities, without laws, and without culture. But it was precisely this savagery that made them dangerous opponents in the eyes of many Romans. Tacitus, for example, portrayed them in his work Germania not only as a threat, but also as an antithesis to Roman decadence, free, unspoiled, unbending. In this way, the Battle of Varus also became a mirror in which Rome looked at itself, and in which it recognized its own weakness. The propaganda of the imperial era also used the battle to emphasize the role of the respective rulers. Augustus was shown as a grieving but steadfast emperor who held the empire together despite the defeat. Tiberius presented himself as the sober ruler who stabilized the situation on the Rhine. And Germanicus was celebrated as a youthful hero who filled the empire with pride again through his campaigns. In this way, the memory of the Battle of Varus also became a stage for imperial self-portrayal. In the collective memory of the Romans, the Battle of Varus remained a trauma, but at the same time it was woven into the great narrative of strength and perseverance. They did not forget that 3 legions had been lost, but they also remembered that Rome had not perished despite this catastrophe. The battle became a reminder that even the greatest power in the world was vulnerable, and that this vulnerability could be overcome with determination. The fear of Germania, however, remained. In the decades after the battle, no Roman general dared to strive for permanent conquest on the other side of the Rhine. The country was considered invincible, and the memory of the fall of Varus served as a warning example. The borders of the empire were no longer expanded, but strengthened, and the Rhine became the permanent line between Rome and the world of the Germanic tribes. Thus, the Battle of Varus lived on in Rome, as a horror image, as propaganda, and as a myth. It was a symbol of the limits of Roman power, a trauma that shook and shaped the Romans at the same time. Augustus' words to reclaim the legions reverberated for generations, and they made defeat an integral part of cultural memory. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was thus more than a military catastrophe for the Romans. It became a story to be told, a lesson to be passed on, and a myth that combined fear, grief, and propaganda. And so it remained alive long after the last bones sank into the moor and the last legionnaires had met their deaths. Chapter 19. Arminius as a hero of freedom, Germanic heritage and myth-making. Arminius, the prince's son from the tribe of the Cherusei, had become a figure after the Battle of Varus that radiated far beyond his own time. For the Romans, he was a traitor who, as a former officer in the service of Rome, had broken the laws of loyalty and led 3 legions to their downfall by cunning. For the Germanic tribes, on the other hand, he became a symbol of resistance, a liberator from Roman rule, a man who had shown that even the greatest power of the world at that time could fail in the forests of Germania. The ancient sources portray Arminius in a double light. Tacitus describes him as a clever and brave leader, but at the same time as a victim of the internal disputes among the tribes. After the victory over Varus, Arminius was by no means unchallenged. Although its prestige was enormous, the Germanic world was not a unified state, but a mosaic of tribes, families, and rivalries. Soon after the battle, tensions began with other princes, above all with Segestes, who envied his leadership and accused him of betraying joint agreements. Arminius' wife Thusnelda also got caught up in these conflicts and was captured by the Romans, making his personal battle against Rome even more bitter. For the Germanic tribes, however, Arminius remained the face of victory. He had understood how to unite the tribes for a brief moment, to put their different interests aside and to lead them against the common enemy. This feat was rare and would hardly be repeated in later centuries. The victory over Varus was therefore inseparably linked to his name. Even though the tribes soon fell into discord again and Rome fought back under Germanicus, Arminius was remembered as the one who had shown the Romans that they were not invincible. In Roman memory, he was an ambivalent figure. On the one hand, he was hated because he was responsible for the greatest defeat of the imperial era. On the other hand, he was also admired because, as a barbarian, he had used a ruse that would have been more likely to be attributable to a Roman general. Tacitus calls him the liberator of Germania and concedes that he would have deserved to be celebrated by the Romans if he had not been their opponent. This shows that even in the enemy camp, Arminius had an aura that made him an extraordinary figure. With the end of his life, the myth-making began. Arminius did not die in Roman captivity, but through the intrigues of other Germanic princes who feared his growing power. His death thus became a symbol of the fragmentation of the Germanic world. The man who defeated Rome did not fall by Roman swords, but by the envy and rivalry of his own people. This tragedy gave his character an additional dimension. He was a hero who had won freedom, but whose own people could not endure him permanently. In later centuries, Arminius was repeatedly reinterpreted. In the Middle Ages, his name was largely forgotten, but in the early modern period, interest in him was reawakened. Humanists and historians took up the reports of the Roman authors and saw in Arminius the first defender of a German identity. He became known under the name Hermann, a Germanization of his name that made him a national hero. Especially in the 19th century, in times of emerging nationalism, it became a symbol of unity and freedom. The Hermann monument near Detmold, erected in 1875, is an expression of this veneration. There, the monumental figure of Arminius rises, his sword stretched to heaven, as an eternal sign of independence. But the myth-making also had its downsides. Arminius was not only celebrated as a hero of freedom, but also co-opted by political currents. In the German Empire, he was considered a symbol of German strength. In National Socialism, he was glorified as a pioneer of the Germanic race. These instrumentalizations distorted the image of the historical Arminius and made him a tool of ideological interpretations. In truth, he was a prince who stood between worlds, educated in Rome, familiar with their culture, but at the same time deeply rooted in the traditions of the Germanic peoples. His actions were shaped as much by personal rivalries as by political goals. Today, Arminius is viewed in a more differentiated way. Researchers do not see him as a timeless hero, but as a leader who recognized Rome's weakness at the right moment and knew how to use it. His victory was more the result of a clever trap and the special conditions of the terrain than of a permanent superiority of the Germanic tribes. Nevertheless, it remains undisputed that his name is inextricably linked with the Battle of Varus and that he had a decisive influence on the history of Europe. The myths that surround Arminius tell less about the man himself than about the needs of those who remembered him. For the Romans, he was the barbarian who led them to their limits. For the Germanic tribes, he was the liberator. For the Germans of the 19th century, he became the founder of a national identity. For the National Socialists, a falsified symbol of their ideology. It was reshaped in each epoch, depending on the stories you wanted to tell. And yet, under all these layers of myths, the core remains. Arminius was the man who dared to challenge Rome, and who managed to lure the strongest military power of his time into a trap and destroy it. Whether you call him Hermann or Arminius, whether you see him as a hero or traitor, his act was a turning point. He thus stands not only as a figure of the Germanic past, but also as a symbol of the power of cunning, courage and freedom against an overpowering order. Chapter 20. The long-term consequences, border on the Rhine and the limits of expansion. The Battle of Varus was more than a military catastrophe. It marked a turning point in the history of Rome and redefined the borders of the empire for centuries to come. Until then, Augustus had pursued the dream of integrating Germania and Gaul into the order of the empire. The Romans had founded cities, introduced administrative structures and consequently built roads and camps that underpinned their presence. But after the defeat against Arminius and his allies, this dream was shattered. The Rhine became the final border, and beyond this river began a world that influenced Rome but never ruled it. The immediate consequences were political and military. Rome had lost 3 legions in a single blow, and these numbers could not be easily replaced. New recruits had to be drafted, but it took time for the army's effectiveness to be restored. The loss of experienced officers and soldiers was more severe than any material damage. Augustus himself was shocked, and his famous exclamation about the lost legions makes it clear that not only men but symbols of Roman power had been wiped out here. The reconquest attempts under Germanicus in the years 14 to 16 AD were militarily successful, but they did not change the strategic decision. Tiberius, the sober successor of Augustus, realized that Germania could not be held permanently. The land was too big, too impassable, the tribes too fragmented and at the same time too resilient. Every victory had to be secured by new campaigns, and every campaign devoured enormous resources. Tiberius drew the conclusion: Rome would not cross the Rhine permanently, but would make this river a border. This marked the beginning of a development that became formative for Roman history. The Rhine, together with the Danube, henceforth formed the northern and eastern lines of the empire. Behind these rivers, the Romans built an elaborate system of camps, roads, and fortresses that became known as the limes. This fortified border area was a buffer zone between Rome and the Germanic tribes not only militarily, but also economically and culturally. Trade and exchange continued to take place, but the idea of a complete integration of Germania disappeared. In the long term, the Battle of Varus also had a psychological effect. It showed Rome its limits. The empire could not grow indefinitely, and there were regions that escaped control. The illusion that the Roman order could be extended over the entire known world was destroyed. Instead of limitless expansion, the focus was now on securing the existing territories. The policy of the emperors after Augustus was increasingly defensive. They wanted to preserve, not conquer. For the Germanic tribes, however, the victory of 9 AD did not mean that they remained permanently free and united. Although Arminius had proven that Rome could be defeated, the tribes soon fell back into rivalries. There was a lack of a permanent political structure that could have transformed the victory into a common empire. Despite all the defeats, Rome remained a powerful neighbor, and the Germanic tribes remained a patchwork of peoples who allied themselves sometimes against and sometimes with each other. As much as the victory was celebrated in the Teutoburg Forest, it did little to change the fundamental fragmentation. And yet there was also a strength in this fragmentation. Because the tribes could not be permanently brought under central rule, Rome could never subdue them in a single blow. The country remained restless, difficult to control, and always a source of insecurity for the Romans. The victory over Varus had shown that even the mightiest army in the world could be destroyed in the forests of Germania. This memory hovered over the heads of Roman generals, who henceforth proceeded more cautiously. The consequences of the Battle of Varus reached far beyond antiquity. In European history, it became a symbol of the fact that a local power could resist a world power. It shaped the idea that the Rhine was a natural border that also played a role in later centuries. Even in modern times, this image was used when it came to the cultural and political separation between the West and the Germanic region. For Rome, however, the most important consequence was that the expansionist policy was pursued more moderately. Instead of subjugating the Germanic forests, the focus was on securing the rich provinces in the Mediterranean, on expanding infrastructure, and on internal stability. The limes became a symbol of Roman rationality, not the endless striving for more, but the pragmatic safeguarding of the existing. For centuries, the Rhine remained the border between two worlds. On the one hand, the empire with its cities, roads, and laws; on the other hand, the tribes, whose independence could never be completely broken. This contrast determined the history of Central Europe far beyond antiquity. Thus, the long-term consequence of the Battle of Varus was not only the defeat of 3 legions, but the recognition of a border. Rome had learned in the Teutoburg Forest that even its power was not unlimited. This lesson led to a reorganization of Roman strategy, to a consolidation of the empire, and to a demarcation of borders that had a lasting impact on the history of Europe. The Rhine, once just a river, became a line of history, and its origin lay in that distant autumn when Varus and his legions perished in the forest of Germania.